order to protect their daughter, the parents locked him inside a machine that was smaller than 10 square meters. Even when delivering supplies every day, they made sure to keep a safe distance. She could only breathe air filtered by the purification chamber. They thought she would live her entire life in this large, confined space. But unexpectedly, an accident happened one day. The evolution chamber suddenly lit up for no apparent reason. What was even more frightening was that through the glass, they saw a yellow gas rapidly spreading through the streets. This gas was coming from the city's sewage system. The father, who was out on the street, was bewildered, but before he could take more than a few steps, he saw an even larger cloud of gas. In just a moment, the gas had already engulfed him. The street immediately descended into chaos. The man ran desperately toward home. Once inside, he quickly pulled his wife away from the window. In the next instant, the toxic gas instantly obscured the window. It was even more insidious. Luckily, their daughter had the protection of the evolution chamber. The man switched it to energy-saving mode and quickly dragged his wife away. As they watched the toxic gas move upward, they had no choice but to run to higher floors. Finally, the couple reached the top floor. The top floor was home to a kind elderly couple who welcomed them in without hesitation. The mother immediately used the intercom to ask about their daughter's condition. When she learned there was no problem, she sighed in relief. The group then went to the balcony to witness the terrifying sight below. They were at a loss for words. But this wasn't the worst part. The man then climbed to the roof. He saw the entire city covered by the poisonous gas. It appeared like a paradise, but it was filled with hidden dangers, and the poison had caused a citywide power outage. Though the girl was safe inside the evolution chamber, the battery wouldn't last until morning. So the man decided to hold his breath and go downstairs to change the battery. He went to the hallway, tentatively inhaling the air. Although the gas was colorless and odorless, it was toxic. It would take over 10 minutes to go back and forth to change the battery, and no one could hold their breath for that long. The man remembered his elderly neighbor downstairs, who always kept an oxygen tank. For his daughter's safety, he decided to climb down the water pipe just as he entered the toxic air. Then he held his breath and soon reached the correct floor. After breaking the window, he entered the elderly neighbor's apartment. Just as he was about to search, he saw someone lying on the floor. He rushed over and realized it was the elderly neighbor, but he was already dead. The man had no time to mourn. Worse still, the oxygen tank the elderly man always carried was nowhere to be found. Frantically, the man took out his flashlight and searched everywhere. But no matter how many times he searched, he couldn't find it. Just as the man was about to suffocate, he finally found the oxygen tank in a corner. Without wasting any time, he quickly put on the oxygen mask. Then he quickly opened the valve. Finally, at the last second, he took a breath of oxygen. He recovered and waited. He packed the extra oxygen tank. Just as he was about to leave, he suddenly heard a noise from the bedroom. Driven by curiosity, the man raised the hammer and opened the door. To his surprise, it was just a dog. But strangely, the dog seemed perfectly fine and was very excited. Could animals be immune to the gas? But what he saw next proved that theory wrong, because the dog's mother in the room was dead. Though confused, the man had no time to ponder. He rushed home and quickly swapped out his daughter's battery with a spare. He also gathered some essentials. To find more spare batteries, he then descended. The street was eerily silent, strewn with lifeless bodies. He saw people convulsing and foaming at the mouth. The man instinctively adjusted his oxygen mask. He crawled beneath a car and managed to gather a good number of spare batteries. Just as he was about to leave, he suddenly heard a whistle. Curiously, he approached. He saw a large team passing by. He approached them and learned that they were part of a military unit sent to evacuate survivors. The entire city had already fallen. The higher-ups had decided to evacuate a few survivors and then abandon the city. The leader of the team noticed the man's oxygen mask and handed him a fresh oxygen tank. He then urged the man to hurry and join the team, but the man refused to leave because his family was still in danger. The leader hesitated and walked away. At that moment, the man called him back and requested another set of oxygen gear. He explained his daughter's condition, though the equipment was costly. The leader eventually relented and gave him a set. When the man returned home, he was shocked to discover that the poison gas level was still increasing. If they stayed any longer, they'd suffocate. They had to leave with their daughter. But she could only escape if she wore a spacesuit. The spacesuit was in a lab located in the city center. In that moment, the couple decided to take the risk and go for it. Knowing that her parents were heading to the city center, the daughter asked them to check on her friend. Her friend, like her, had a terminal illness, and her parents were never around. The parents refused, because in a situation like this, everyone was only looking out for themselves. They weren't obligated to help someone else's child. Their priority had to be their own family's safety. Then click-box it back with us, Boomer. The couple reluctantly agreed, but they promised to check on the friend on their way. However, when they arrived at the friend's house, they found the house empty. With their oxygen running low, they couldn't afford to stay. They quickly moved on to the lab, where they successfully located the spacesuit. Just as they were about to leave with the suit, the lab exploded. Thankfully, they regained consciousness shortly after, but the man suddenly had difficulty breathing. He realized the oxygen hose had ruptured. Now, they only had one tank left. The couple had no choice but to take turns using it, while also having to carry the heavy spacesuit. They moved slowly, not knowing how much time had passed, but they eventually reached the top floor. Worse still, the oxygen was running out fast. At this rate, they'd both perish. So, the man decided to let his wife go first. He would figure out a way to get home later. His wife hesitated, knowing that without the oxygen, her husband's chances were slim, but thinking of their daughter, she held back her tears and left. What she didn't realize was that this goodbye would be final. In an effort to save oxygen, the wife rushed down the street, but she ran out of air before making it home. Desperate, she removed her oxygen tank and held her breath, painfully dragging the box and climbing upwards. She eventually returned, but what awaited her was more suffocating than the gas itself. She found that the spacesuit had been torn apart by the explosion. All their efforts had been in vain. The woman was consumed by despair. Meanwhile, the man was still making his way home across the rooftops. He stumbled upon a body with a blood trail leading from it, clearly a victim of a murder. He glanced at the blood and nervously entered the building. Inside, there were signs of someone living there, and to his surprise, an oxygen tank was found. He quickly checked the area, and after ensuring it was safe, he took the oxygen tank and left. He was about to lend it to his wife, but just as he was about to step out, a police officer entered. He immediately ordered him to drop the oxygen tank. However, the man saw through the ruse right away. The oxygen tank wasn't his at all. He had taken it from the officer using his weapon. He had brutally killed him to seize it. Once exposed, the officer stopped pretending. His right hand reached for his gun, slowly. But the man had already anticipated this moment. He quickly donned the oxygen mask and shoved the officer into the toxic gas. The two of them fought violently. In the struggle, the officer's gun fell to the floor. The officer tried to reach for it, but the man held him tightly from behind. Without an oxygen mask, the officer lasted only a few seconds before collapsing. The man didn't feel any satisfaction. He knew that if he hadn't been ruthless, he would have been the one lying there instead. He stood up and rushed back home. His wife was waiting for him, but then she suddenly realized that the battery in their daughter's pod was nearly drained. With her husband gone, she didn't know what to do. She decided to risk it and replace the battery herself. Seeing the deadly gas filling the hallway, she took a deep breath and, without hesitation, ran straight into it. She ran as fast as she could, but no matter how quickly she moved, it couldn't outrun the gas. As her mother entered without an oxygen mask, the daughter anxiously waited inside the pod, but the mother didn't have time to explain. She swiftly replaced the battery in the pod. When the instruments lit up, she let out a sigh of relief. But just before she left, she seemed to sense something. She stopped and gazed at her precious daughter finally, after her daughter urged her. The mother reluctantly left. She glanced at her daughter one last time, her beloved daughter finally. As her daughter urged her again, the mother left with great reluctance. After an unknown amount of time, the man arrived at last. But when he saw what lay before him, he froze. He couldn't believe it and slowly approached. As he got closer, the heavy oxygen mask couldn't conceal the tears that streamed down his face. He saw his wife lying in the hallway, already lifeless. He couldn't hold back his tears any longer. But the dead cannot return to the living. He had to remain strong, yet before he could compose himself, his daughter's voice crackled through the intercom. He knew there was no longer any hiding the truth. He understood it was up to him to tell her. But as the words came to his lips, he couldn't say them. He couldn't bear to tell her that her mother was gone. Eventually, he went to the balcony and broke the news to his daughter. Upon hearing the news, the daughter silently curled up in a corner, not saying a word. For the first time, he felt like a burden. Soon after, a tremor shook the house. The poisonous gas, which had been rising slowly, began to ascend at an alarming rate. The building was on the verge of being engulfed. The man decided to venture out once more, hoping for a chance. He sought protective suits for the two elderly, but the elders smiled and shook their heads. Their lives were already nearing an end. They didn't want to take resources meant for the younger. In the end, he took his aging wife by the hand and calmly walked away. Meanwhile, the man was fortunate to find the highest level of protective suit for his daughter in a truck. Worried about being too slow, he grabbed an electric scooter off the side of the road and rode it back, but the visibility in the gas was dangerously low. He sped along, but suddenly a boy dashed out. The man couldn't avoid him and was thrown off his scooter. His head slammed into a metal barrel, and he instantly lost consciousness. When he regained consciousness, he had no idea how much time had passed. He grabbed the intercom and called out for his daughter, but there was no answer from her. He feared the worst. His daughter may have already met a tragic end at home. The man's legs gave way, and he found himself unable to move a single step further. In his despair, he collapsed against the car, preparing to quietly await his end. But then, he suddenly noticed two figures emerging from the mist. The man stood up, barely able to believe his eyes. What unfolded next seemed almost unreal to him. He saw his daughter alive and running toward him. It turned out the friend he'd been searching for had already been taken away by the family's evolution chamber. What he hadn't expected was to find them like this. They were immune to the poison gas. The man was filled with joy at this revelation. But then, in the next instant, he took off his oxygen mask. He paused for a moment, and then, before his daughter's puzzled gaze, the man kissed his daughter on the cheek for the first time. Ironically, when he woke up again, he discovered that he and his daughter had swapped places. Now, it was he who was lying in the evolution chamber, and his daughter